come up to me after, and we'll make sure that you are not in anything that's posted from the Interfaith Coalition or JWI or any of the organizations in the IC. I wanted to thank you all for coming and invite you into JWI's space. Jewish Women International is the leading Jewish organization working to end gender-based violence. We run the Clergy Task Force to end domestic violence in the Jewish community, run prevention programming for teens and young adults across the country, and work on advocacy to end gender-based violence and promote and support women and girls across the country. In 2007, we convened the first of its kind coalition with faith-based organizations working to end domestic violence. And now the IC is almost 40 faith-based organizations that meet monthly to work on federal legislation to work to end domestic violence and sexual violence. The IC got together and formulated a campaign for Domestic Violence Awareness Month, Faith Takes Action, where we'll be shining a light on 4 ways faith-based organizations across the country work to end domestic violence. Today on this panel, we'll be talking about 3 of those ways: prevention, clergy outreach, and direct service. And then later in the month, we will be going to visit offices in the House of Representatives to advocate for the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2018. So thank you all again so much for being here today, and I will turn it over to Negar, our competent host.
Thank you, Dorian, and thank you to JWI for hosting us and for all of you being here. My name is Negar Abai. I work with the Baha'i Office of Public Affairs with the Baha'i community in the United States. And we're very fortunate today to have with us 3 panelists who are well positioned to share with us some of the work that faith communities and organizations are doing to end violence, to end domestic violence, violence which we all know is disproportionately directed towards women and girls and harms everyone. I think that recent events have heightened awareness of how pervasive and entrenched gender-based violence remains. And I think more people recognize the need for us to work together to ensure that a new social conscience takes hold. A social conscience that will make even the mere expression of condescending attitudes towards another human being, let alone physical violence, a source of deep shame. And I think reflecting on the role that religion can play in that context is really worth our time and attention. So it's great to be here, and without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists. They all have very wonderful bios. I'm going to take a moment to just share a little bit. We have here to my right, Salma El-Kadi Abu-Jideri, who is a founding board member of the Peaceful Families Project, which is an organization dedicated to the education of Muslim community leaders and members about domestic violence. Salma provides workshops and develops resources that touch on mental health issues, domestic violence, and healthy relationships. She's a co-author of several books, including a brief guide for helping professionals that's entitled What Islam Says About Domestic Violence. And Salma is also a licensed professional counselor in private practice, working with individuals and families and integrating spirituality and faith. So it's great to have you. And we have Tova Zimm, who is the Victim Advocacy Coordinator for the Jewish Coalition Against Domestic Abuse, otherwise known as JCADA. And Tova graduated from Indiana University last year with a BA in Jewish Studies, American History, and Hebrew. And then after what she describes as sort of a life-changing internship with JCADA's AWARE program, she returned as an Outreach Intern, and then as the first victims advocate, and is now expanding the advocacy program. And she'll share more with us. And then last but certainly not least, we have Jenna Barnett, who leads the Women and Girls campaign at Sojourners, a Christian media and advocacy organization that encourages people to put faith in action towards social justice. And Jenna will tell us more about the work the Women and Girls campaign does, but it includes combating domestic and sexual violence in the context of the church through clergy outreach. And before Jenna joined Sojourners, she worked for the International Rescue Committee and was a peace writer for the Women Peacemakers program of the Joan B. Kroc Institute for Peace. for being with us today. We have a few questions that we'll have panelists engage with and share with us, and then we'll open it up to the audience for some more questions. Hopefully allow for a good amount of time for that to happen. Great. So maybe we can start, we could go down and have each of you share some of the work that you're doing with respect to prevention, engaging religious leaders and direct services. And also in that context, if you could share how you see religion informing that work.
Well, I want to start by thanking JWI for hosting us here and for hosting the Interfaith Coalition, which has been a great resource for all of our organizations and helping us to do our work better. So Peaceful Families Project focuses on domestic violence prevention in Muslim communities, and our training and education is grounded in Islamic teachings and Islamic values. And the idea is that when we teach people from a place that resonates with them, from within their value system, within their faith tradition, that the education will be a lot more powerful, and that there's more of an incentive to change attitudes if it's sort of if the information is already resonating with the person's belief system. So we emphasize the values of justice and peace and mutuality in relationships and gender equity, and we focus a lot on training imams who are the Muslim clergy, and you know, in all faith traditions, the first responders are often clergy, and across faith traditions are often not trained in domestic violence, and so we provide professional development for the imams. And our training model is actually sort of an implementation or a manifestation of one of our Quranic verses, that the believing men and the believing women are friends and supporters of each other in enjoying right and forbidding wrong. And so our training team is often a co-facilitation team between an imam and an advocate or practitioner. And so we're modeling sort of this working together, men and women, to end domestic violence and to change attitudes. So we train clergy, we train community leaders, we provide healthy relationship workshops for couples and singles, and we also provide cultural sensitivity training to providers who work with Muslims so that they can have more effective service delivery if they're understanding kind of the important cultural values and religious values. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we do.
So I work for the Jewish Coalition Against Domestic Abuse. We're in Rockville. We also have an office in DC, and we just expanded to Northern Virginia as well. So we're a nonprofit. We serve victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, rape, stalking, elder abuse. We are a Jewish agency, but we serve everybody regardless of faith, background, gender, sexual orientation. All of our services are free. So we have clinical services, legal services, and victim advocacy. So the clinical piece is therapy. So we don't have a cap on therapy. So some of our clients stay with us for 8, maybe 10 years, maybe longer. A lot of our clients have been with us for a very long time. We have free legal representation in peace and protective order hearings. And then victim advocacy is my role. So it's sort of case management mixed with a lot of other pieces, but it's just about helping clients meet their needs to the best of our ability, whether that's financial assistance, housing assistance, helping somebody move to a shelter, accompanying somebody to court, and offering them emotional support. It's a lot of moving pieces. And then we also have a program called AWARE, which is our prevention effort. So we offer workshops to high school and college students on healthy relationships, domestic violence, and then we have a workshop called Healthy Friendships for our middle school students. And then we do an outreach program as well to clergy throughout the greater DC area. We train mostly rabbis, maharats, other types of Jewish leaders, but we've expanded into other faith communities as well. Just doing trainings, what is domestic violence, how do you respond to it when a congregant comes to you with a personal story. So that's sort of the work that we're doing. So a lot of what we do is asking rabbis to give sermons, taking a moment of silence during different parts of davening, different parts of prayer, to help create a safe space within their religious communities. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we're doing.
So I'm here speaking more to the clergy outreach, and Sojourners is well equipped to do that because we're both a media and an advocacy
Advocacy Organization, and we really try and have our Christian faith be both what motivates and sustains our work, and our work combating domestic and sexual violence in the church and through the church is no different. For the theology that helps guide this work, for me it really boils down to this. Jesus is someone who understands abuse through the cross, but didn't let that be the end of the story. There's liberation in the resurrection, and Jesus would want that for people in abusive relationships as well. So we have a God who can empathize and who understands suffering, but even more so wants their liberation, just as he experienced. And through that, we lift that up through storytelling, but I want to zoom in on 2 actions that we've done in the past year that have been really helpful and informative. The first is a national survey of 1,000 pastors on domestic and sexual violence, and this really comes from the belief that if you want to help shape a landscape, you really should understand it first. So at first in 2014, we partnered with IMA World Health, and We Will Speak Out to survey 1,000 pastors on their attitudes and actions around domestic and sexual violence. And then we just did a follow-up this summer. So uniquely positioned us to see, with all that's been happening in the past year with Me Too, how far we've come and how much we've changed. And the good news is that in every way possible, there is improvement. So more pastors are acknowledging domestic and sexual violence as a problem. More pastors are seeking training to address that, and more are preaching on this regularly. So for instance, 51% of pastors speak regularly to their churches on domestic and sexual violence in 2018, as compared to 34% in 2014. So a nearly 20% increase in just 4 years is pretty significant. The most revealing thing that this survey showed for me was just how prevalent it is. So 9 out of 10 pastors that we surveyed said that they encountered domestic and sexual violence through their work as pastors, which really gets at why it's so important that our clergy be trained, because like y'all were both saying, they are often the first responders. However, only 50% of pastors felt that they were adequately trained to respond. So though there's improvement, there's a long way to go. And one of the things that we try and do is recognize that though there are 50% who aren't trained, that means that there are 50% that are. And though there are only 50% that are regularly preaching, we want to lift up those so that others will be resourced and inspired to do the same. And so that's why we started this initiative called the 100 Sermons Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. We're starting in January, actually after hearing Oprah talk at the Golden Globes so passionately against this type of violence. I was like, I want to hear this from the pulpit. And so knew that there were preachers out there doing it, and again wanted to really shine a spotlight on them so others could see what it sounds like and be motivated to do the same. So actually last week we launched all 100 sermons, and they came from 28 different states, 3 different countries, and 20 different Christian denominations. So the geographical and theological spectrum that is displayed through these sermons is really inspiring.
Great, thank you so much. I think that thinking of the constructive role that an influence that religion can have, both rooted in sort of principles and values that speak to the sacredness and dignity of the human being, the partnership of men and women, and the liberation of the human spirit that's possible is really valuable, and then how that translates into concrete action and understanding. And this is complex work with many dynamics at play, and so I was wondering if you could also speak a little bit to some of the experiences of survivors in the community, as well as sort of some of the obstacles that you have confronted in your work. We can, yes, we should. That works. Otherwise, poor Jenna's gonna keep going. I just realized that.
Yeah, so it's kind of a complex phenomenon when we talked about faith and domestic violence, where survivors often rely heavily on their faith to deal with their struggles and to get inspiration and to feel like they're not alone. And at the same time, we see that survivors are often sort of abused using religion as a weapon and a control tactic. So across faith traditions, there are scriptures that can be taken out of context or completely misused to manipulate. And And so a survivor's faith is often really challenged, and it becomes complicated when a survivor goes out to friends or family in the community or to clergy and is basically being pressured to stay in an abusive relationship using religious values like patience and be patient and forgive and pray and so this can of course wear down a survivor's faith, and also I think it's pretty common for survivors to question where was God when I was praying, and how come God didn't stop the abuse, right? And so people can often have kind of a spiritual crisis, and so for us it really reaffirms the work that we do at Peaceful Families Project to help people reconnect with the teachings and the text and the underlying sort of intention, like the underlying objectives of our teachings, which are really about promoting preservation of life, human dignity, peace and safety. And so, it kind of, we try to help people reconnect with those teachings in a way that supports people's well-being, as opposed to when the teachings are kind of misused and end up supporting or enabling abusive relationships to continue. So it's really an opportunity because faith is often so important to survivors, Muslim women survivors and women and men survivors of other faiths, but it's challenging, right? So we encourage people to think critically and to question, not just to kind of swallow what they may have been taught traditionally, but to really look at the text and examine their relationship with the text and their relationship with God as the creator and the sustainer and the just, and to kind of reframe and recontextualize what's going on in the abusive situation so that they can move towards safety and healing.
You said it beautifully, echoing what you just said. One thing I hear a lot from our clients when they go to clergy and tell them what's going on, there's a concept in Judaism called Shalom Bayit, peace in the home, and especially in the Orthodox Jewish community, I've heard a lot of clients tell me, well, I told my rabbi and he told me, well, Shalom Bayit is in the hands of the woman. It's the woman's role to preserve peace in the home. So what are you doing wrong? What can you do differently to preserve this marriage? So sort of, combating that misuse of that concept is a big piece that we're working on. And I think for a long time, the beginning of my work, I focused a lot on the barriers that Judaism was creating and the challenges, but as we're talking about in these interfaith coalitions, it's also good to reverse that and, how can these customs and these laws be used to help survivors? So we talk a lot about, how do we help rabbis, how do we help religious communities create safe spaces? So we've, since this is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, the synagogue I belong to hosted a Purple Shabbat this past Shabbat. So we put purple tablecloths down, and I was asked to give the sermon, and so I spoke a lot about my personal experiences that led me to this work, and just being with a community that listened and welcomed my story was really powerful. And I kind of realized in that moment, this is what we should be doing. This is how we create safe spaces, by asking congregants to speak to their communities, and through the survivor stories, transforming clergy's perspective, because I think the trainings do a lot, but also those personal stories and one-on-one discussion has been very effective through what I've seen.
Yeah, building off of what both of the panelists were saying, there are scriptures where if you don't use just so much caution and context can be used to promote a kind of marriage that has a dangerous power dynamic within heterosexual relationships. So just having thoughtful and thorough analysis of those texts is important. And then another obstacle I see is churches that prioritize preventing divorce rather than preventing violence, and I think that is really misguided priorities that mirrors some of the things we've seen of Christians in the news prioritizing the reputation of charismatic men over the reputation of vulnerable people, which I think is pretty antithetical to our religious values. I'm thankful that I think all of our traditions have lamentation as something that is in our toolbox, because I think it's needed to acknowledge all of the obstacles and challenges that exist, but thankful that we also have hope so that we can move forward from here. Another obstacle I've seen specifically with clergy outreach is people who are passionate about this, but it is a very sensitive topic, and so because they're so scared that they will say the wrong thing, they say nothing. And so I wanted to read just two sentences from one of the sermons that we highlighted. This is from Reverend Anna Ernst. She says, "These are uncomfortable topics. Perhaps even more of an uncomfortable situation would be one in which we left all these topics unaddressed, without any faith perspective to share with which to consider them."
You've all spoken so articulately to the way that really there are these spiritual resources that we can draw on, but then also there can be sort of certain interpretations that limit, and that at work I sort of heard in everyone is kind of this false dichotomy that I don't think the spirit of any of the faith traditions really reinforces, but that somehow surfaces, which is this false dichotomy between unity and justice, or maintaining peace and justice, when in fact a more profound understanding of what that cohesion and unity and peace is demands justice. And so I think that all faith scriptures really speak to that, and it was interesting how it came out in your comments. And I think that in the work that you do, it's clear that social change needs to happen at the level of individuals, of families, community, institutions, and that takes long-term commitment. So I think it'd be valuable for us to hear what it is that sustains your action over time and in the face of inevitable crises. And then also, given that domestic violence is often understood as a private affair, like, what is the role of community in that context? And maybe to mix it up a bit, Tova, would you like to start? And then we can go to Jenna and end with you, Sama, if that works.
Yeah. It's a tricky question, and it's a lot to unpack.
There's a lot going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think, opening up the discussions and really listening to one another is the biggest piece for creating these safe spaces and transforming religious communities from being perceived as, sometimes in my personal experience previously, a harsh environment where I'm going to be judged if I come forward about this, and I'm going to be seen as violating customs if I choose to leave somebody, or whatever that may be. But I think, looking at each custom and thinking how we can transform that custom. So there's a big custom of going to the mikvah in Judaism, which is sort of like a ritual bath that women immerse in for various reasons. And I had a client once who said that, so the law says that when you're married, you go to the mikvah once a month after your period ends. And so it's perceived in some communities that after you go to the mikvah, you come home and you will have sex with your husband that night. And so she said that when she went to the mikvah, she felt like she was being raped all over again every single month. But she loved going to the mikvah, and she didn't want to stop doing that because that was very empowering for her before this. So we decided to do a mikvah attendant training for all of the local mikvahs in our area, and explain how this custom can be perceived differently than it should be. And so we did an hour-and-a-half in-service with different mikvah attendants, who are the women that would take congregants into the mikvah and lead the prayers with them. And it was very eye-opening for them to kind of see a different perspective. So that was very empowering for me to help people in the community sort of use this law that was seen as a weapon to a lot of people and turn it into something empowering. And I think just sitting with a lot of my clients who are very religious and very spiritual, and who have been able to overcome trauma without losing their faith, and without backing off on their observancy, has really sustained me in this movement, because I went through a period personally where I really backed off from my religion because I felt like it had been used as a weapon against me. But to meet other people who haven't given up on that and who have been able to avoid channeling their anger at their religion is really keeping me in this movement.
Yeah, one question that I get sometimes from Christian faith leaders are them saying, like, yeah, of course we don't want domestic violence to exist. Of course we want it to go away and we want it to end, but is it really my job to end it? And my answer is yes and no. Yes, you have a role in it, but it can be overwhelming if you think it is totally your job. And one of the biggest things we try and get faith leaders to understand is their own limits. If you're a pastor, you know, you're not a social worker, you're not a licensed therapist, you're not a police officer, and thank God you're not all of those things at once. But we know domestic violence is something that impacts every part of our community, from our health system to our criminal justice system with the abuse to prison pipeline, to our education system. And so it takes all of us, and the fact that pastors are the ones who I'm interacting with the most are there to help with the spiritual trauma. They're there to gesture to an open door and then refer out, I think is something that can help this become more sustainable and feel more manageable for pastors. Something that gave me hope from the survey that we did is that now, for those who have addressed domestic and sexual violence situations, the most common course of action is referring out to experts at 81%. And I think that shows how the community is so connected and coming at this in many different ways. And that's one thing that gives me hope. The other is from all of the messages of the pastors I heard in the 100 sermons against domestic and sexual violence. I remember one day was particularly poignant in that I was listening to a sermon against this type of violence when the news broke about the 300 priests in Pennsylvania. And we have to know that exists. We have to bring that to the light. I think the only way that it can be sustainable and for that to not just overwhelm us is to have other pastors interjecting that hope and saying that happened, that is not in my name and not in the name of my religion.
So I'm listening to both of you, and I'm thinking about like the systemic nature of domestic violence, and also the way that it intersects with things like clergy abuse. And really, the only way that we can make real change is like the work of the coalition. Like, we're all working together. We're working across faith traditions, and we're also, addressing the needs of the individual, the needs of our leaders, the needs of our communities. And we can't, like, if we're only focusing on one of those pieces, we're not really going to get that systemic change. So, as somebody who's been doing this work for about 20 years, I can notice sort of my own journey, sort of that initially was fueled by anger, a lot of anger, and over the course of time has shifted. So anger still exists when I hear, any kind of, abuse, and especially when it's like a widespread, issue. And then the compassion that I've since developed for our clergy who are trying to address a problem that they aren't prepared to address in most cases. And when we do our imam trainings, I've also seen sort of the growth in the recognition that they need the training. So when we first started offering these trainings, we could barely get 2 people to sign up. And now we have to turn people away. And so that's very hopeful for me that there has been change. You do have to stay around long enough to see the change, because it doesn't happen very fast. But even listening to the results of your survey, so just hearing the growth and the number of sermons that are being given, so that's very hopeful. And then for me, what sustains me also is being connected to people who are doing the work, so that I'm not alone doing this work, you're not alone doing this work. And sometimes it can feel like we're very isolated in doing the work, and when there's so much bad news, it can feel so overwhelming. How are we ever going to make a real dent in this? And yet we are. We're chipping away at this little by little. Everybody's doing their piece of the work, and it is making a difference. And we respond is so differently from when they came in, you know, so you can kind of see that transformation happen sometimes. And you know, we have imams sometimes will send us their sermons that they want to make sure that they're saying it right. Like you said, sometimes there's that fear, you know, well, what if I don't say it quite right? I might do more harm than good, so I won't say anything. So you know, we are also trying to get imams to deliver more sermons, especially during Domestic Violence Awareness Month, but throughout the year and from different angles. And slowly that change is happening. And you know, it's always something that I remind myself that anyone who's ever made a societal change or societal difference had to work really long and hard to get there. So you know, we're not any different here. We just have to keep encouraging each other and working together to see the change.
All really, really important, and it seems that you know, as so many studies and theories have acknowledged, that sort of power and power dynamics are at play here, whether in the context of the family or people in positions of authority within church or religious institutions, and that part of ending domestic violence seems to be an offering of a reconceptualization of power, including the power that comes through solidarity and working with others, through women being able to connect with scriptures and their faith in their own right. And so I think you've also articulately spoken to that as well. So at this point, we'd like to open it up to the audience. There are questions, please feel free to raise your hand, and we have, I think, a good amount of time to be able to address them. So if there are any questions, let me know. Please.
I've heard each of you talk about how ill-prepared our religious leaders are in dealing with domestic violence. And so I'm wondering if there's a movement, either any of your organizations are doing this work, or there's a movement within your faith traditions of like trying to engage the schools that train our religious leaders. So trying to work, I know there's lots of work, right, that you guys are doing, clergy outreach once they're kind of already on the pulpit, but is there work trying to educate our leaders before that happens?
I don't know of any specific movement, and maybe you guys have a better answer, but I think that's a really, really important topic. And I just mentioned to our director the other day, actually, my dream in this work, I think my end goal would be to be able to create some type of program that would go to yeshivas, to rabbinic schools, to train future rabbis about this issue, because I spoke with my rabbi about this recently, and he said when they're in rabbinic school, there's supposed to be one brief training on healthy relationships or something of that nature, but it doesn't seem to be very effective. So that's a personal goal of mine, to eventually someday get permission to go to rabbinic schools and lead, you know, not an hour training, but an in-service, maybe a day or two of working with, you know, people who are experiencing domestic violence, the whole shebang. I don't know if you guys know of anything different, but.
No, but it's a dream I have too, to see this training. I do see a trend though in, you know, seminaries, like Hartford Seminary, other programs that train chaplains to provide this sort of, as part of the pastoral care. Imams have a different route and training than clergy in the Christian and Jewish tradition, so there isn't like just one road that imams take to become imams. And so some of them have formal training and some of them don't. They might just be chosen by the community to lead because they're knowledgeable. So the trend that I'm seeing is that imams are taking courses in counseling and taking courses in domestic violence. Sometimes it's after they've come to one of our trainings, but I'm also meeting more imams who, you know, have like two degrees, so the Islamic Studies degree and then a Marriage and Family Therapy degree, simply because they're recognizing that their religious studies program did not prepare them. And as we're able to reach more imams and meet them when they're younger and earlier in their career, and of course they learn from each other, so when they meet their peers who are taking this kind of coursework, then it encourages them. But mostly I think they're recognizing that they're just not able to respond appropriately, and so they're seeking other kinds of training. So that's hopeful but it would be great if we had a more sort of systematic approach as part of training.
Yeah, similarly, the study that we did when we zoomed in on seminary education, pastors said that 45% of them had received good seminary training on domestic and sexual violence. When we zoomed in on the young, more young pastors, that number got larger. I can't remember exactly what it was. So there's some hope in that. Sojourners is hoping to continue to work with IMA World Health to get a better feel for, okay, what does your training look like? How can we make it to where if 90% of pastors will encounter domestic or sexual violence situations, that 100% of them get trained, and making it a part of everyone's seminary education is certainly one way to address that, though it does leave a pocket of evangelical pastors who don't necessarily have seminary as part of their education out of that puzzle. But hoping to get a better feel for, well, what our seminary is doing. Is it a mandatory course? Is it a one-time optional training? And if you make it optional, is that training going to look a lot like this room looks like right now, which is entirely women? And how can we get more men involved?
Mostly women.
I'm sorry,
there's one man. Thank you for being here.
I wonder if I could add something to that, because I think the importance of training during seminary is so important, and I know in Jewish tradition it's a bit haphazard depending on the denomination, depending on who's doing the clergy work at the time. But the other experience that JWI has seen and responded to are clergy who don't really get it while they're in seminary, but then they have the experience firsthand of what it means when they're ill-equipped to deal with issues of domestic violence that show up in their community and in their synagogue, how to do the best work, how to follow up. And so one of the things that we did at JWI, which I think is something we feel very proud of, is created a clergy task force. We've also learned that clergy respond to clergy, right? It just, in so many ways.
Yeah.
So that while Deborah convenes this clergy task force, it's led by the clergy themselves from a variety of denominations, and they address the issues that are relevant around domestic and sexual violence. They're in fact doing some work around Me Too as well. Deborah, I don't know if you want to add anything
We've
to
also
that.
done training, we do training webinars for their peers throughout the Jewish community. So because we think clergy training is so important and it's difficult to get to the seminaries. I myself have done training at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College for their classes for the 5th year rabbinical students. But it can be very challenging to get an actual program because everybody's curriculum and time is so packed. But we find that this webinar series is very helpful, and so we create resources for the clergy, and they're led by clergy, which I think is really important. I wanted to ask something to you. One of the things that's frightened me in this area is that the clergy will speak out, and then what? So then you think it's a safe space.
Mm-hmm.
You come forward. We did a study in 2004 or 5 asking rabbis if there was any domestic violence in their congregations, and many of them said no. And then we said, well, have you ever spoken about it? And they said no. We said, well, if you speak about it, you'll be surprised what you'll uncover. Which turned out to be true, but then my fear was, okay, so then the rabbi or cantor, somebody speaks about it, and then some woman comes forward, and then he or she says something that's life-threatening, right? So one of my goals is always to pair that. So I wanted to ask you, with the sermons, which is fantastic, have you paired training with it? Like, is everybody who's giving that sermon already trained so that they have some?
Yeah, so both with the initial outreach, because that was my biggest fear as well, is that people would speak about it, open up a wound that they weren't ready to address in any way. When we were outreaching, we included resource on the not outrage email, but that's one way to put it. On the email calling for sermons and on the page calling for sermons, we had resources there available. And then after all of the pastors submitted their sermons, when we thanked them, we continued say, you likely already do, but sermons at their best are a gesture to an open door, and you need to be ready when someone walks through that door. So yeah, I think it has to be a holistic approach, and preaching is just, I wouldn't even call it the first step, because you need to be ready when someone comes forward.
A follow-up question for you. The study that you've been referring to, is that available for people to access?
Yes, so the study is called Broken Silence 2.0, Pastors' Attitudes and Actions Around Domestic and Sexual Violence in the Me Too Era, and you can find it on the We Will Speak Out website, or just Googling it, it should come up.
Okay, great, thank you.
Other questions? Please.
Could you share a little bit about how you're engaging men and boys in ending domestic violence, and from a faith perspective, how do you view and approach those who have perpetuated violence?
Can I add something onto that? So within the space of congregations, also I know many congregations will have distinct youth groups where the pastor or the imam or the rabbi or so could also engage youth, boys and girls. And as we know that violence and abuse relationships can definitely start manifesting once young boys and girls start hitting that age of things start changing in their middle school and so forth. How do you message, or maybe has your work thought about how to train ministers? Sometimes they want to leave it to the responsibility of the parents or so, right? But how do we think about engaging young boys and so through the laity at that young age, maybe through these specific spaces? If we can't promote these healthy relationships within the sacred space of the congregations, how do we expect them to live their lives as good Christians, Muslims, and Jews out in open secular spaces?
Okay, so a question about how engage men and boys, and then in particular youth, generally speaking, and then also sort of what, from a faith perspective, how we think about perpetrators of violence.
That's like 3 questions in one.
Yes. And with a bang.
So I can talk a little bit about what we do and our perspective from the Islamic perspective. But since our training model includes partnering with imams, and imams are for the most part men, and so we've already got that built into our model that we're working collaboratively, and we continue to try to engage our leadership as well as community members, because we firmly believe that we can't end domestic violence if only half of the world, the women, are working on this issue. So we need everybody to work on this together. So we're always partnering. And in our programming, we make sure that we are addressing the abuse that happens to boys and men as well. So with the clergy abuse, it affects so many boys. And domestic violence affects boys who are growing up in violent households. And so, we really try to have more of a holistic approach, and then recognizing that when we're addressing perpetrators or working, with families who have been affected by perpetrators who are male, that the whole family is affected, and those children, they still need a father, and so we want to address this in a more holistic way, rather than sometimes it feels like we have a victim focus or a perpetrator focus. We have a family focus, and I think that's a little different because it is informed by our faith. In terms of how we view a perpetration, it's from our perspective, it is any kind of violence is a form of oppression and injustice, which any Muslim off the street is going to agree that that's not acceptable in our faith. And so when injustice is committed, or oppression, or any form of abuse, then it's a sin. So it's a crime. It's often a crime. It's also a sin. And there's a process for coming back from committing a sin. So when you harm another human being, and you need to repent, that repentance includes feeling remorse, asking forgiveness from God, stopping that behavior. In other words, you've got to learn how to behave differently, and making reparations to whoever was harmed, and getting forgiveness from the person that you harmed. So it's it's a complex process. Unfortunately, you know, people often stop at, okay, well, he expressed remorse, so now we're gonna give him another chance. But our model, the Islamic model, is actually this whole package. All the pieces have to be there. And then, you know, if a person has gone through all of that, and there are consequences. If you violate someone, then there's consequences, punishment, accountability, and after all of that, if a person is able to, you know, repair themselves, repair the damage, there's room for that person to come back. That doesn't happen very often, as we know. Even, you know, people who go through matters intervention programs, you know, that we have a very high rate of recidivism. But from a spiritual point of view, there is space for this person to come back and reconnect spiritually, not necessarily with the victim survivor, but to be back in the community space. And so it's a hopeful model. I think we need our religious leaders on board and more on board, and our communities more on board to help us take people through that whole process. That's maybe a long answer to your question of how we view this. Yeah.
Did you have thoughts, Jen?
Yeah, so as far as engaging men and boys, a lot of the work that we're doing around that is geared towards youth at my agency through this AWARE program that we have. And just, I think this year was the first year that we recreated stories just for boys. So some of the schools, we go to public schools and private schools, so we do our workshop in boys' schools as well. And so sometimes when we go to co-ed schools, depending on what kind of agreement we make with the schools, sometimes we might have a separate workshop for smaller groups of boys, just because the discussion can be different and there's different, you know, different topics that might come up. But as far as the clergy piece goes, similar to what you were saying, so every Jewish community is different, but most of what I'm doing is in the Orthodox community, just because that's the community I come from, so that's where I'm focusing on. So most of the leaders are men. So we have a clergy board of rabbis, and they're all men that I'm working with right now. So just sort of, you know, working on that education piece and helping male clergy educate other male clergy, sort of where we're at right now with that. As far as the perspective of perpetrators, we do have this philosophy of forgiveness that can't really be ignored, so we try to work around that. And similar to what you were saying, I think you phrased it really nicely, that you know, it's a family dynamic that we're working with, so not encouraging people to forgive a perpetrator, but allowing them to, you know, move on and connect in some type of spiritual way. I don't know if that makes sense exactly, but it's kind of the perpetrator piece is a hard piece for me to unpack, so.
Yeah, I appreciate the way both of you framed it. I think when talking about having perpetrators come back into a community, just always prioritizing the safety of the victim and the survivor first and foremost. And I think you articulated a lot of it very well, so I'm not going to go too deeply into it, but just also remembering that forgiveness doesn't look like returning back to the way things were. So you can re-enter the community, but you may be re-entering it in a different role, in a different position with new boundaries surrounding you, and that's the only responsible way to do it. As far as engaging men, I can't remember, someone said just recently that engaging clergy is the most effective thing to do. When we were first doing the outreach for the 100 sermons, we were getting almost exclusively sermons from women, which was interesting given that, you know, I think it's 1 out of 10 or only 1 out of every 11 Protestant pastors is a woman. And so I asked the president of Sojourners to write a column engaging men, and within like 2 weeks of him writing a call out for men to engage this, we had several more sermons come in, which was really hopeful. Still, the balance overall, I think, was 65% or 70% women who submitted sermons. But I think we're onto something when we say that male clergy, engaging male clergy is a start. And it's, sorry, I didn't address the youth thing, but I know several denominations are working on specific curriculums for the youth right now, which I'm encouraged by, but it isn't something Sojourners has engaged as much.
Yeah, that was the piece I forgot to mention, that Peaceful Families Project has recently developed a curriculum for youth on healthy relationships, and it's designed to be like a 12-week program. It's been piloted, and we're looking forward to rolling that out soon. And you know, in terms of our leadership training, that includes like Sunday school teachers, youth leaders, in addition to the clergy. So we train our clergy separately because they really do learn better and engage better when they are there just with their peers. And then we have separate training for the community leaders, which includes the teachers and youth leaders. So we're trying to get at each of these pieces.
It strikes me that it would be very interesting to have a broader conversation about approaches to restorative justice or holistic approaches, because whereas in the context of a workplace one can fire someone, in the context of industry or public persona, you get rid of the public platform. I mean, there's some immediate things one can do, but in the context of families and communities, what does that look like? What are the relationships that happen? How do you get to a place where everyone is protected and served adequately? So it's important insights. It would be really nice to see where that could go if that conversation happens. So I think that we are coming to the end of our time, but if there's any last question, we could entertain that. Please.
Hi, my name is Ali. I'm with the Religious Action Center of Reformed Judaism. So you all kind of touched on the systemic nature of intimate partner violence, and I'm curious what we as a faith community can do to make sure that all of this great work that's happening on the pulpit, on the bema, behind closed doors doesn't occur in a vacuum, and how we can affect a whole culture change beyond our religious institutions.
I think a lot more collaborative work. So, we often work within our communities, and even Peaceful Families Project, we work within our community, but then we also try to engage with the service providers who may not be within the Muslim community. So part of every workshop that we do, we're inviting the providers who may not be Muslim into the community, and we're trying to build these bridges all the time, because we have to work collaboratively, right? And so it's making a very intentional effort to make those connections all the time, because it's really easy to just focus in, and then to do interfaith work and faith communities working with secular communities. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to do. So that's just kind of my thought to respond.
I would have to echo that. I think the interfaith work has been the most powerful for me as far as creating a bigger transformation, because it does feel like it's kind of closed when you're just working in your synagogue and if there's a sermon here and there. But I think just collaborating with other faiths and other agencies, and like you said, inviting other types of agencies into your community. It's a huge question, so I wish I had a better answer, but I think working collaboratively and just thinking bigger and expanding throughout your county or your city, whatever. Yeah.
And I think it shows the power of when interfaith coalitions such as this, to get at the systemic nature of things, also advocate for policy, like the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization. So trying to advocate within your communities, within your church, synagogue, etc., but also within Capitol Hill.
Thank you for your questions. If there's a final thought that you'd like to share, we can allow time for that, and, but also if you'd like, we can close up. So I know if there was sort of something that you wanted to still address, or a final thought you wanted to leave us with. We've covered a lot of important ground, so let's go.
I have a final thought I wanted to share. So I was restraining myself. I wanted to respond to you. It's something that Selma said earlier. We have come so far. I mean, you really need to stick with this for years. But when we started our work, JW always believed that faith had a place in domestic violence, and that faith can be a resource and a support. And when we started doing this work, even now we're a steering committee member of the National Task Force on Sexual and Domestic Violence, and helping to craft the New Violence Against Women Act, and all the work that we're doing on Capitol Hill, and all the work that we're doing in this interfaith space. We were not welcome at the table. It was, faith is a barrier. If you're a person of faith, you will never leave that relationship because too many people are telling you, you made your bed, stay there, divorce is unacceptable, shalom bayit, whatever they were saying. And we flipped it. We said, no, faith can be an incredible resource. And the spiritual component is incredibly important. And we have something to say, and we have something to add to the conversation. So now when we go to Capitol Hill, they want to hear from faith communities. They want to hear those voices. We need all this training, all this prevention work. Everything that we're doing is building, and it's going to create that. I am hopeful, ever hopeful. You can't be in this work if you're not hopeful. I'm ever hopeful that we're going to change that dynamic. And we're working more and more with the advocates themselves, who are the direct service providers, because they understand that also. So it's all those pieces together. We're going to create that systemic change. Right, Selma?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're just going to keep working at it, keep working together. And I'm really really grateful, for these collaborations and partnerships. And yes, you have to stay in for the long haul.
Yes.
If you want to see the change, you gotta don't quit. Just keep going.
Amen.
Well, that seems like a strong note to end on. So, well, and then I think there's time for conversation afterwards. So thank you all for joining us.